Everybody, welcome to this HCRI event. I think almost everybody in this room knows who I am, but in case you don't, I'm Miriam Bradley. I'm a senior lecturer here, and I, among other things, organise our events. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to, oh, my phone's gone blank, so I can't check the date. I also want to invite you all to our landmark lecture, which is taking place on Tuesday, the 18th of February, so just under 2 weeks from now, 6 o'clock. And our speaker for that is Professor Alex Doval, who is speaking on, I don't have the exact information here, but starvation and famine, a kind of history of famine, and that should be super interesting. So please sign up for that and come along to that. Moving to today, we are very privileged to have here with us Tom Scott-Smith, who is going to be talking about his new book, which is this, and I've just been reading, and it's really excellent. Tom is the director of the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford, where he's also associate professor of forced migration, and he works on ethnographic and on the ethnographic and historical study of humanitarian relief. Yeah, he's also a BBC New Generation thinker, which is something I didn't know about him. And his previous book was on the history of humanitarian nutrition, and now he's telling us about his most recent book, which is on the history, or more the politics, of humanitarian shelter. So he's going to talk for 45 minutes, and we'll have a chance for questions afterwards.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about my new book, Fragments of Home, which is a project about humanitarian shelter. But I wanted to start at the end, really, and tell you what it is that I want to argue in this presentation and what I argue in the book. And that is that autonomy, the concept of autonomy, is a crucial missing element in the way that we think about humanitarian shelter and possibly humanitarianism as a whole. Now, what do I mean by autonomy? I mean the ability to act independently. I mean the capacity to make your own decisions. And I like Joseph Raz's definition, which is the ability to shape one's own life and determine its course, seemingly in lots of small and insignificant ways. Now, I know that for many critical scholars, any mention of freedom or autonomy or concepts like this will immediately smack of something like the ongoing march of neoliberalism into the humanitarian sector. But what I want to try and persuade you is that this is a concept which is very much important to the humanitarian sector and which is absolutely essential to the way that emergency shelter should be provided. And this emerged from the research project that I conducted a few years ago, the results of which are in the book. Now, the reason I think they fit is fundamentally about scope, because I used the word autonomy rather than freedom deliberately. Autonomy is much less grand, it's much less ideological, and if you look at the definitions of it, it's something that we can make sense of when it's advanced incrementally, by which I mean we can have autonomy over small parts of our life, even if the bigger things in our life seem outside of our control. And at the moment, an awful lot, of course, seems outside of our control. So I'm going to begin with these two observations. One is that shelter is all about the little things. I will show you what I mean by that in just a moment. And secondly, that humanitarianism is famously bad at tackling the big things, by which I mean the root causes, the structural injustices. For forced migrants, of course, it means the difficulty of tackling restrictive border policies. So that's where I'm going to start, and that's where I'm going to end, with this notion of autonomy. Now, the project that I'm going to talk about, and that led to this book, began actually around a decade ago, just after the 2015 Summer of Migration through Europe. The project was called Architecture for Displacement. It was based at the Refugee Studies Centre, where I am. And the aim was to examine how different countries handled the enormous refugee flows of that year, 2015 to 2016 in particular. I studied 7 different places and looked at the techniques that were being used to accommodate refugees. But I also wanted to say that this isn't just purely of historical interest. The kind of themes that emerged were not just themes from 2015. Because I think it's fair to say that we are still living in a crisis of shelter for asylum seekers and forced migrants today. We can say that there are tens of thousands of people currently being accommodated in hotels at great cost. Money that, as this headline in the Standard reveals, was all being taken from the aid budget. So 4.3 billion in the last year was reported to have been coming from the aid budget, which represents about a quarter of the international aid budget being spent on asylum hotels in this country. And the money is primarily going to private companies. This is the Mail reporting on what they call the migrant hotel king, Graham King, who went into the Sunday Times rich list because of the money that he was making from asylum seeker accommodation. And of course, the point I also want to make is this is benefiting nobody. This is a headline from the Express. When the Bibi Stockholm, the infamous barge in Dorset, was closed, its inhabitants were moved into hotels, or as the Express puts it, cushy hotels, which shows that not only are these forms of accommodation generating a lot of resentment amongst publics, they're turning asylum seekers into a target, but as I hope to show in this presentation, they're not good places to live for months on end if you're at the receiving end as well. Now, this is really at the heart of the politics of shelter that I'm talking about. But the situation we're dealing with in the UK, of course, is nothing compared to the scale of the crisis in 2015, where in Germany alone, around 1 million people claimed asylum in 2015 to 2016, which is obviously completely different to the tens of thousands of people we're talking about in the UK. And we had thousands of people sleeping on the streets because they couldn't have accommodation when they first arrived. So a genuine crisis in 2015, which was really the subject of the research project that I began. Now, the project was looking, here's the book, you're very kindly already seen a copy. The project was looking at 3 fundamental questions, the starting questions. Firstly, I was trying to understand how refugees were being accommodated in different countries of Europe and the Middle East in the months and years after that crisis of 2015. There were lots of different approaches that were being used, and I wanted to document them. Secondly, it was a project looking at what worked, what didn't, and why, particularly focusing on the role of architecture and design, because this was a moment when architects poured out in their hundreds with suggestions and ideas and proposals about how to build new accommodation for refugees at very short notice. And finally, I had a more philosophical question, which was to ask, what is basic shelter in the end? What are the most important components of this need that we all share? And again, this is where the politics of shelter really emerges. If asylum hotels in Britain are described by the press and considered widely in the public as being cushy places to live, how do we define what is essential? What is included in the remit of the basic and what isn't? Now, in the early days of this project, I spent some time mapping out the various ways that people were finding shelter through doing short fieldwork trips in 2015 and 2016. And I'm going to show you some photos that I think really illustrate the diversity of this topic of emergency shelter. So we saw a lot of self-built shelters, particularly in those early days of the crisis. This is a picture from the Calais jungle of shelters made of wood and tarpaulin. Here is another example from the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, a bit more permanent this time. You can see the floors have been built up with stones. The roofs are weighed down with tires, but it's the same basic model in the Bekaa Valley. We saw a lot of shipping containers being used as shelter, these stark cuboids of steel adapted for use in refugee camps. This picture is again in Calais, all stacked up and numbered in long lines as an attempt by the French government to introduce more sanitary conditions. And here they are in Jordan in a slightly different format after they've been painted, adapted, ripped apart, rearranged around a courtyard. And here you can see also a satellite dish on the roof, but it's still a shipping container. We saw lots of vast institutional dormitories over those few years, set up often in empty buildings or abandoned buildings. So this one is in a hangar at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. And you can see at the bottom of the picture the open chipboard boxes that stood in for bedrooms, and at the top the high iron roof and the enormous amount of space in the building. This picture shows another example, again from Lebanon. This is an old, abandoned, empty shopping mall that was filled with refugees. Each shop front was rented by a family, and you can see their washing hanging over the walkways in front of each of the shop fronts. There were thousands of, as I said, seemingly innovative shelter designs. This one, a flat-packed shelter in a box funded by IKEA, was the subject of a paper that I wrote quite early in the project. But here is another, a vast inflatable shelter, pressurized with a current of air and erected in no time. This example stood on the tarmac of an old abandoned railway station in northern Paris, but there were others all over Europe. Now, this interesting design was a particularly striking feature. There were so many ideas being written up that many of my contacts in aid agencies would talk about the shelter spam, that they would appear in their inboxes every day with a new design. The ideas included pop-up shelters that could be dropped from an aircraft, clothing that transformed into tents, units that stacked together like styrofoam cups, and even ideas to reclaim whole islands from the Mediterranean Sea. So after mapping these different kinds of shelter, I chose 7 projects to look at in more detail, and these are the 7 main chapters of the book. Each chapter looks at a different example of refugee shelter in detail, and each of these examples was from a different country. They all show how ideas of shelter tend to emphasize different things, different elements. So some ideas focus very much on the aesthetics of the final building. Some are interested in articulating a list of basic requirements for shelter. Others presented shelter as very much a matter of politics. And so I was trying to represent the different diversity of forms in the different chapters of the book. Now, I'm going to go through some of these chapters in a bit of detail to tell you about the shelters. But before, I just wanted to explain why I called the book Fragments of Home. What's going on with that title? Well, the central argument here is that refugee shelter is contentious and has a very complicated politics surrounding it because we expect so many things from shelter as a concept. If you try and define what basic shelter means, it's something that's always slipping away from you. So we could think of it as just a roof to keep off the rain, a piece of canvas like this, which might be useful for a few nights, but obviously is not enough in the longer term. But it's clear we need shelter to do more than just provide a roof from the rain. It needs to include privacy. It needs to include a lockable door. We need to keep warm inside a shelter. It needs insulation. And then we need enough space so we're not all crammed in together. But things don't stop there, because if you look at definitions of shelter in the international humanitarian industry, you then get other metrics. Places to wash are required for cleanliness and good health. We need shelters to have kitchens so that people can prepare meals. And then we get into the need for community, because people expect to be able to have a cultural and social life as well. All of this means that the expectations of shelter pile up and pile up, even if in reality they're not necessarily being met. Here is a picture of a very large and depressing camp in the middle of the desert called Azraq. It's in Jordan. Now, it might meet some of the requirements of basic shelter, but it certainly can't do anything for cultural life, for social life, for human flourishing. Now, the upshot of all these different desires that are poured into shelter is that policymakers have to make difficult decisions about what they are going to prioritize when they begin a shelter project. And it's perhaps inevitable that as a result, shelters will fall short. They will emphasize some elements over others. And in the end, they can only ever provide fragments of home. This is the idea of the book. But what fragments do they prioritize? That's the question. And that's what I'm focusing on in each of these different chapters. So the first chapter is called Shelter as Basics. And it sets the scene by looking at the dream of manufacturing a universal basic home. In particular, it's about the flat pack design that I mentioned earlier from Sweden, which was funded by IKEA, which claimed to try and capture the essence of shelter in a single structure. So this meant boiling things down to the basics, breaking shelter down into little parts or little fragments. Here you can see them stacked in a warehouse. putting these parts in a box and shipping them overseas so they could then be reassembled when they were needed. Now, the chapter discusses how the result became inevitably contentious, even though they were trying to just cover the basics. When it ended up in situ, like here, in a refugee camp, some people accused the shelter of being far too mean, for doing little, for looking like a chemical toilet, for having no insulation, for lacking a proper floor, for having these tiny, ugly little windows. But ironically, other people said that it was trying to do too much, for producing something that was too finished, something that was too culturally specific, a product that didn't really allow people to adapt it to their own basic needs. As you can see, it looks like a very European kind of house. Others pointed out that it did too much because it made no sense to send packets of prefabricated plastic all over the world rather than using local materials. So this chapter is trying to demonstrate that when you try and boil things down to the basics, when you try and distill what shelter is, you will always end up with political disputes about what is too little and what is too much. And it also points out that shelter is contextual. A universal shelter, like the aim of this project, cannot ever really truly exist. Now, in the second chapter, I turn to Jordan and tell the story of two enormous refugee camps which were created in the desert. I've already shown a picture of one of them. The planners in these camps were trying to provide everything that refugees might need in a rural location. So it was a model that moved beyond the basics and tried to provide a much more comprehensive model of shelter, linking shelters together, providing everything from supermarkets to schools, piped water to paved roads. And I call it shelter as metrics because the checklists for this model were extensive. Everything was closely measured, everything was carefully ordered. The metrics stipulated not just the square meters of living space that could be allocated per person, but also the ceiling height of each shelter, the ratio of plot size to living space, the dimensions of all the roads and the fire breaks, the distance to the water points. And this camp in particular, Azraq, was described as a model camp by many people in the humanitarian sector because it met the metrics. It checked all the boxes in the guidelines. But it raised a question, which was how can such a terrible looking place be described as a model of anything? Well, there was an interesting story here because the camp of Azraq was built after the perceived failings of a first camp, an earlier camp, Zartri camp. And this was a place where humanitarians felt that they had lost control because the refugees had reshaped the whole environment. They had painted their shelters, as you can see here. They moved their caravans into compounds, planted trees. And as a result, the aid workers felt as though they didn't know what was going on in this settlement that they had created, quite frankly, according to the metrics. Now, I'm going to show you a short section of film. I have 3 sections of film to show you, which I made with a colleague called Mark Breeze. We thought that because we were looking at shelter, which is obviously a very material, very visual topic, it made sense to make a film as we went. So I have 3 short sections of documentary film. And the first one comes from Jordan, and it tells the story of this particular tale of 2 camps, as I call it in the book.
In Zatari, after the first phase of the emergency, we understood that the tent will not last for more than a year. UNHCR with the government and especially with donors especially from the Gulf countries, we got access to what we call caravan. A caravan is a prefabricated building made of panels. In Europe, we use this kind of facilities on the construction site. This is the office, the meeting room, eventually some accommodation for the workers. This is what we use today in Zatari as a shelter. Today we have 24,000 caravans.
Zatari is wonderful because you can talk about how people changed the way that the whole camp layout was planned so that it fits their own needs, which is ultimately what any person working on shelter would want. So Zaatari had prefabricated units. So they were basically ready and they were delivered to the camp. And then they're so mobile that the refugees actually put the caravans, what we call caravans, this is a prefab unit, on wheels, and then they would take it wherever they want in the camp.
So what the refugees did by themselves at night, and they are very creative. They got access to welding machine and they weld this kind of chassis or trolley. And 30 men were able to lift a caravan, and at night they reshape all the caravans. And they reshape the caravan the way they want it. They make basically a U shape with 3 caravans, or they make a square shape with 4 caravans.
I think it was captured on video. It's extremely funny because you can see it from top that the house is moving basically. And it's actually a lot of people carrying that.
Imagine the reaction of our team coming the next day, where basically in this huge surface area, their either tent or caravan disappeared. And this has never stopped. And we have never been able to control this movement of caravan in Zaatari. Years of the existence of Zaatari, we understood the lesson learned of this camp. And it was the wish of the government to establish a new camp. And this has been the camp of Azraq. The idea of Azraq was to basically repeat Zaatari, but in a more controlled way.
The main experience in Zaatari was the disorganization, because people were just coming in large numbers and we weren't able to accommodate them properly, or let's say plan their settlement in a sense. And we couldn't keep track of the movement of people inside the camp because people were actually moving their prefabs. In Israel, it's a bit of a rigid grid, but basically the idea was to allow the people to have space for their own activities. It was established in a military area, so there was no neighboring city that the camp community can interact with.
Population today in Azraq, it's about 40,000 people, half of Zaatari. So smaller camp, better control by the authorities and also the UN community. If the market has been developed by the refugees themselves in Zaatari, the market in Azraq has been controlled and incorporated in the urban plan. In the camps, you will find supermarkets. To avoid any duplication and fraud, we use the iSkin system for payment. So when it's come to pay at the cashier, we scan the eye of the beneficiary, so the amount of the expenses is directly linked to his file.
So hopefully you can see from that film how shelter as metrics worked. The aid workers that I interviewed there were quite explicit about the transition being, sorry, I'm not quite sure what. Okay, I'm back, sorry. They were quite explicit about the need for order in the place. And Azraq became a location that was famous for its restrictions. Refugees needed permission to enter or leave the camp. They couldn't adapt their homes. Growing trees and bushes was banned in place, ostensibly on security grounds, but a lot of it, again, was to do with control. And the camp manager famously said that he wanted an unobstructed view from one end of the camp to the other so he could see exactly what was going on. But I want to move now to chapter 3 which is looking at a very different model of shelter, almost the polar opposite. And this was a shelter founded in Athens, which expressed the idea that shelter can and should be a form of politics. So the story began after a group of activists occupied a hotel. This one you can see in the picture. It was called Hotel City Plaza, and it had been empty since the financial crash in 2008. Over the summer of 2015, the activists broke in, they cleaned up the hotel, and they created what they called a self-governing community for refugees. When I spoke to one of the organizers, they said this wasn't just a shelter, it was also a political act, and they were very explicit about that. The idea was to construct an egalitarian community, a place where migrants and citizens could live together and make decisions together. It wasn't about meeting purely physical needs, but from the very beginning, it was about building a new way of living together, a new kind of society. One statement even described the hotel as a workshop of solidarity and resistance. That is, resistance to the Greek government's approach of putting refugees in camps that weren't unlike Azraq, resistance against border controls, even resistance against the state itself. But there was something missing, because refugees who entered Hotel City Plaza didn't have a lot of choice when they went to live there. They weren't necessarily interested in radically egalitarian forms of social organization or in opposing borders and the nation state. In fact, when I spoke to many of them, they had quite conservative political leanings. They wanted somewhere to live in the heart of the city that gave them a degree of dignity. They didn't want to be pushed into remote areas and isolated camps. But their final aim wasn't to smash borders. In fact, their final aim was to live in a stable nation state. It was also clear that many were quite happy with hierarchy. In fact, when they arrived, the first thing they wanted to know was who the manager was. But of course, there wasn't a manager. Everything was run by committees. So we might say again that the common theme was about control. It was about who controlled the space and what people expected from the politics of shelter. And it turned out there were lots of subtle pressures that, of course, were operating on people in this kind of environment. Now, I'm going to show another short film here, which explains this example in a little bit more detail. And then I will continue with the next chapter afterwards.
When people started arriving in Athens, again, political activists, mainly political activists, or activists from the pro-refugees movement, tried to organize structures. And there were hundreds of anarchists or activists who did it without a plan for the whole political situation, whom we had to help refugees.
For us, City Plaza is not only a building, it's a space, it's an idea. It is an alternative, it is a way that we want to propose to the people, to the government, that there's a way to deal different refugees. The residents that are living here, they are responsible of daily life here. The main idea behind City Plaza is self-organization. You have to participate because otherwise it will not work. It can be a fun, it can be a political idea, it can be a lot of other things. It's a place that we try to build a community.
I think that City Plaza is doing an excellent job. The framework that they have created in that building, but we have to keep in mind that keeping a lot of people in a small space for a long time is not good by any definition. Look at prisons, look at small and crowded neighborhoods or areas or houses, etc. It's never a good thing. It has to be short term.
The Scots
have been an incredibly effective and human solution for very many people who've been through Athens. My concern and my discomfort is whether or not people in a vulnerable situation who are looking to access shelter and services are in a position to say no to the political agenda which comes with accepting those. You have to sign up to a political project that wants the destruction of nation states in order to get a bed for the night.
I know that some of the Scots dream of the revolution, if I may say so. So basically using this reality and using people basically to create the conditions for a reaction. So I can understand that. I know that this is a very valuable political tool. I completely disagree, if I may say so, but nevertheless, we try to keep a balance also in that context.
As much as I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Scots, I also think that they're not necessarily the best practice. They might be really well run, they might have great community, but in terms of sustainability, we can't endorse something that has a chance of shutting down at any point.
I believe that the changes and alternative models need to have a long-term schedule, a long-term idea, not to be a bubble or not to be an event of the present political conditions.
Fundamental problem here is you have a solution for asylum-seeking populations which is based on an explicit challenge to nation states, borders, and private property, which is, depending on your political views, an entirely valid response, but it's not a response that then invites obvious lessons for large institutions and nation states to follow.
Okay, so that's the chapter on shelter as an explicitly political act. But I'm going to turn now to the next chapter, which is about shelter as an example of tactics. And by that, I mean that humanitarians and refugees in Lebanon, which is the topic of this chapter, had to respond to a situation where they didn't have any formal options on the table. Lebanon had an explicit no-camp policy at the time, and aid agencies were seriously constrained in what they could do. So as a result, forced migrants ended up living in all sorts of improvised buildings which were scattered across the country. And they included old factories, chicken farms, warehouses like this one, the empty shopping mall I showed you earlier. There were also many informal settlements made from cheap building materials that were constructed illegally on patches of land. You can see in this photo how many of the shelters were constructed from old materials, like in this case, an advertising hoarding that had been wrapped around the wooden frame. The juxtaposition, I think, between the aspirations of mass consumerism and the reality of the refugee settlement is quite stark in this example. But in this chapter, I'm telling the story of how refugees and humanitarians found a way around the restrictions in Lebanon. How, because they couldn't develop any broader strategic visions of shelter, we were left with shelter as tactics. Now I'm going to leave it there because I don't have a huge amount of time, and turn now to chapter 5, which I call shelter as pragmatics. Now this is slightly different, and it focuses on Germany, where the response involved the state being brought in to adapt many large empty buildings and turning them into dormitories for refugees. So I already mentioned Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, which is probably one of the most famous. It was built under Nazi rule in the 1930s, but there were many others as well, and they often had these troubling historical resonances like Tempelhof. They included the former Stasi headquarters in Lichtenberg, this huge 1970s conference center in West Berlin called the ICC, and there were also abandoned department stores, schools, The buildings of former concentration camps like at Dachau were also used, and of course, Tempelhof. Now, in this last section of film I'm going to show you, I talked to the people running the shelter who reflected on the problems it faced, and that I think reveal, again, some of the political issues surrounding humanitarian shelter.
I think during that time, shelter meant I'm not on the street. These emergency shelters were really, their only goal in the beginning was to prevent homelessness.
Yeah, well, everybody in this world dreams of an overall plan, but at least it's difficult to get one. We had a bad situation really in the beginning. October 2015, we had a deficit of about 10,000 places for people. In the morning, we didn't really know, will it be 200 or will it be 2,000 people coming today? And you cannot plan accommodation for this situation. It's impossible. That's why we started to use the sports halls and some public buildings and well, everything we could get somehow.
Well, we confiscate buildings now. And that's what they did. They just knocked on the door of their district mayors and say, you got these 3 school gyms next door, they now belong to us. And I said, well, we don't have the keys here. Okay, I'll give you 1 hour to organize the keys. Wait.
Tempelhof Airport was closed in 2008, and there was a big discussion still going on, about how to use this building. And so we decided, okay, there is 7 empty hangars. We tried to build in refugee accommodation.
It was always clear that they would want to use it because obviously it's a lot, I don't know, through governmental eyes, is probably a lot of space. I remember when I first entered this hangar, I don't know, through this like massive metal door, and you just entered, obviously it's huge because it's a garage for airplanes. And yeah, it's just like this massive industrial hall with very bad lights.
We were running out of beds. And it was simply not possible to call anybody saying, well, would you sell us beds and how many do you need? 1,000. What do you mean 1,000? Yeah, we need 1,000 beds and we need them tomorrow. I remember that situation when we got a lorry full of beds and some that I wanted to have cash, so we had to organize cash to pay the Dutch guy to buy the beds to put them into the Tempelhof. So yeah, funny situations.
So we have a big hangar with air conditions, pretty loud. And in those hangars, they bring up drywalls and put beds in it. And there is no roof on top, it's not closed. And there is no door, there's just blankets or something.
500 people in one room, no roof above them. You always had a noisy atmosphere there, even if people were not talking in a loud voice, but nearly whispering. But you always had this sound of many people doing whatever people do.
50 people have a cough, 30 people have sex, 20 people snore, 2 children are running around the whole night. You cannot really sleep there.
We came here, it was on the night around 11. You cannot feel comfortable inside. It was horrible. It was like one small room. It was with 6 beds, upper and lower top. It's the minimum 8 people sleeping inside, or maybe 12 maximum, without roof, without door. And about the food was normal people, yeah, they will not eat it, to be honest. You know, like it's just macaroni with the water and some vegetables, and that's all.
And after a couple of weeks that we were asked for the first time, when can we cook our own meals? When is it possible to cook our own meals? Cooking for the family means so much to these people from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Eritrea, Somalia, wherever they come from. We always thought showers and toilets would be the main issue. It's food.
In the beginning, it was rather, rather German food.
We asked, could you organize food for 250 people? Now, they will arrive in 2 hours. Where do they come from and what do they eat? And I said, well, we don't know.
We constantly worked on really improving it because food is always a topic.
I don't know what they eat, but I'd say no pork.
So we ended up making a film about 6 of the chapters. I've just shown 5-minute clips, but each of them were about 15 minutes. It's quite hard when making an academic film to get characters to keep the viewers interested, but this guy was definitely a character. He makes me cringe, even now at times. But this section of the film, of course, I think illustrates well how life in these huge dormitories was very carefully regulated. Everyone's day had to be structured in the same manner in order to make it work for that many people. The overhead lights were turned on first thing in the day at 7 o'clock. They were turned off at 11 o'clock at night, but nobody had control over the lighting in their own part of the building. There were fixed meal times. People had no power to make the food that they wanted. And control became the most crucial problem for the individuals living there. Now, I'm going to go over the last 2 chapters very briefly, just in a minute or so, because I'm running out of time. Chapter 6 looks at an approach in Vienna, which was described by the designers as shelter as poetics. And they were inspired here by the work of Gaston Bachelard, and particularly his idea of the poetics of space. The idea in this case was to populate very soulless office blocks, which were available in Vienna, with small items of furniture. This is an example of the kind of building that they were intervening in, an office block with no soul at all, a concrete monstrosity in many ways. But they filled the building with these items made from yellow chipboard, adding colour, but also thinking about how they could use space. This is a kitchen so that people could cook for themselves. This is another example where they constructed parasols, which were surrounded by curtains in order to create small rooms within an office space. The parasol, of course, filtered the harsh light from above, which was only turned on and off at fixed times, but it meant that there was a controllable area within the office block with a very cheap architectural intervention in this case. And then the final chapter, Shelter as Aesthetics, tells the story of that big inflatable bubble that I showed you earlier. Here is another image of it. A story that I say was really driven by the idea that the most important thing about shelter is the aesthetics. And the mayor of Paris, in this case, asked the architects to produce a symbol of the city's compassionate intent. It looked quite cool, certainly, but the symbolism, in a way, disguised what was actually going on inside this shelter, which was partly a building that was really not fit for purpose as a place to live. It was incredibly hot and sweaty and noisy, but also a building which was actually all about processing asylum seekers for deportation. So despite this symbolic optimism of the design, what was going on was the old-fashioned politics of restrictionism. Now, those are my 7 chapters, and the book as a whole shows that every attempt to provide emergency shelter ends up focusing on a particular aspect of the problem. Shelter as a political act, shelter as a list of metrics, shelter defined by the aesthetics, by the symbolism. And it all raises the question about what is most important when you're going in to design shelter. In the conclusion, I return to the place I started my presentation today, which is to say that I think the element that was missing from these projects was autonomy. The recurring issue was all about control. Shelter was being provided from the top down. The decision about what was most important about shelter was also being imposed, and life was being restricted within these locations in many small but meaningful ways. And if you think about how you would feel to live in a place where small elements of your daily routine were being shaped by other people, if the lights in your bedroom had turned on automatically at 6 o'clock in the morning, if you weren't able to decide what food you ate for breakfast, if strangers were coming in and out of your home every day, the cumulative effect of these very small things is extremely damaging over a several-year period. And that's what I meant at the beginning when I said shelter is about the small things, getting the small things right, even when humanitarians are not good at dealing with the big things. So I argue in the book that shelter should be seen as an opportunity to increase people's autonomy in situations that seem deliberately designed to restrict it. Spaces where people can pick up the pieces of their lives and make choices, however limited, about how they shape their days. Obviously, a huge amount is outside of people's control when they have to live in an emergency shelter. Their final legal status, where they're going to end up living, all the money that is available is, of course, restricted. But at the end, the lesson, I think, is to ask questions of humanitarian designers and architects and aid agencies about when you begin to approach a shelter project. The key question should be, how can shelter expand autonomous action? How can shelter allow control over daily routines? And how they can help inhabitants to carve out a distinctive future? So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Tom. So we have about 40 minutes for questions. We might have some online questions as well, so we'll check with Sophie in a minute. Do you want to take a seat or stay standing up?
I don't.
What else? Do you want to stay standing? Okay. So before I forget, at 3:30 there'll be refreshments on the ground floor, but I'm not sure which room. Andrew, do you know?
AG9.
AG9, but we'll all go there afterwards. Tom, am I right in saying that all the videos, the full-length videos, are available online somewhere if people are interested?
Yes, they are. So, well, 4 of them are available on the Refugee Studies Centre website at rse.ox.act.up/shelter without shelter. But they should be there if you search for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 4 of the 6 parts.
A little plug. And then, having read most of the book, I also wanted to just, well, encourage everyone here to read it, because if you're here, you're presumably interested. I thought it was brilliant, and I think it really does an amazing job of centering the human. Not only, so most importantly and most obviously from what you've just seen, it centers the refugee, refugee as human. But I would also say it does an amazing job of making the reader feel human, in the sense that it's beautifully written. It's really got lots of evocative descriptions, and you feel like someone's just talking to you and telling you a story, which for an academic book is kind of amazing. And I think, I mean, it offers a pretty scathing critique of humanitarian shelter, but it still manages to treat all the people that fail all the way through as very human. And I think you see that a little bit in the videos. Like it's very kind of empathetic towards an understanding of why people take the decisions they take, even if those decisions ultimately completely restrict the autonomy of the refugees living in these shelters. So it's my little plug for the book, because it's really, really great. And now we can open up to questions. Should we take, I think we'll take like 2 or 3 in batches, if anyone wants to. I was going to say, Rasheen, you look like you've got a hand nearly going up. Yeah, let's start with Rasheen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to reading the book. I might steal it off Miriam when she's finished. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the gender politics around shelter, because it struck me even from the film that the majority of people involved in the decision making around this, that we saw at least, were men. And I was thinking, I imagine if there'd been more women involved in that, food wouldn't have come as such a surprise in terms of the last example. But yeah, just I wanted to say a little bit more about that, and whether how that plays through the book.
Lola?
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you looked at cash assistance as a form of shelter support in any of your projects, maybe in the case of Lebanon, perhaps? Because if we talk about autonomy and giving people control over where they live or how they live, maybe giving cash to let them choose their own rental accommodation seems to be a better way, of course, within certain budget constraints. So yeah, cash assistance, if you have looked at it, maybe you can just share your reflections on it.
Do we have Larissa?
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess I'm curious a little bit about the before and the after, in the sense of sort of what made you think about architecture and design as the lens through which you wanted to approach the topic, and then for the after, sort of what have been the reactions from either the people you spoke to or the aid agencies themselves to the critiques you present?
I was asking myself that a lot as I read the book as well.
Yeah.
Do you want to take those questions?
Yeah, so there's lots there. They're all fantastic questions. So on the gender politics, I mean, you're absolutely right. So this is one of the big themes. And in fact, I think I don't talk enough about it in the book, partly because the sector is dominated by men. So the people that I ended up talking to tended to be men. And then when it came to doing the ethnographic work in the shelters, for many reasons, of course, I tend to get access to male-dominated spaces within them. Also, a lot of these shelters in Europe do tend to be inhabited by single men, and they tend to be separated off in that way. I think maybe one of the questions is, why is this shelter sector male-dominated? And I think it probably comes from the engineering mentality, which tends to be the way that aid agencies have traditionally looked at the problem, which is that you need to construct, and you need to construct things as quickly as possible when you have an emergency. I did think a lot, although I didn't write massively, about the distinction between home and shelter. Interesting that the title of the book was originally Fragments of Shelter, because in fact it is a book about shelter. It's not really a book about home, except insofar as home is lacking. It's not there. And there is a big literature in refugee studies about homemaking, which I only briefly touch on because I'm talking about the emergency phase. But the publishers felt that this was a more poetic title, and I do kind of agree with them, and that's just one of the things that you have to say. But yes, the gender politics is, I think, a whole other book really should be written about that. So the cash assistance is one of the key, well, there aren't really recommendations in the conclusion, but is one of the things that I do advocate for as something that really can provide autonomy in the way that most political philosophers have defined it, which is to give people substantive power and to give them meaningful choice about the options that are available to them. And if you do give cash, that's precisely what you can provide. Now, the chapter in Lebanon focused in particular on, I guess it was a form of cash assistance, but it wasn't being given to refugees. So the big program in Lebanon that everyone was very excited about and that was considered to be extremely innovative was an idea that involved giving cash to landlords so that they could finish buildings. And you know, in Lebanon, there is a tradition, like in many countries in the Middle East, to leave buildings unfinished, partly for tax reasons, because you don't need to pay tax until the building is completed, but you can add an extra layer on at the top. And so the aid agencies came up with this plan, this model, where they would pay landlords to finish an unfinished apartment on condition that they would then rent it out, well, rent-free, give it rent-free to refugees for a year. But of course, this is the opposite of what you were talking about. You know, this doesn't give autonomy at all. All it does is transfer wealth to people who are already wealthy, which is the landlords. And sure, it does give you secure tenure for a year or maybe 18 months, but then refugees are basically back where they started. So I think that is a good example of where thinking through cash and working with the market, it fails fundamentally. Whereas true cash assistance, by which I would mean unconditional cash transfers to people, well, I don't know where it happens, because I did study a project in Jordan which was based on vouchers, but for it to be genuinely unconditional requires an enormous amount of political bravery from a leader to actually advocate for that, because of course the political environment in most places is to give refugees and asylum seekers less resources, less choice, less power, rather than more. But I'm interested in anyone's reflections on cash about that. So Larissa, yeah, on your question. So the starting point was architecture and design, because, as you know, my previous interest had been on innovation and technology, and that was what I had written my previous book on humanitarian nutrition about, how people turn deeply political humanitarian issues into something amenable to a technocratic solution. You know, you have your magic bullets. And it seems to me this was exactly what was happening in 2015. The architects were all coming out and saying, we've got this, you know, this technological solution. And I began the project with this skepticism that I had inherited about how the architects were completely missing the point, because the problem with refugee shelter in particular was a fundamentally political one. And designers, you know, there were these events all about what design can do and what design can achieve in the world of humanitarianism, but none of them were reflecting on what design couldn't achieve, which of course was tackling the problem of militarized borders and a lack of refugee rights and resourcing and so on. But I did soften my view as a result of the project, because in my team that I had employed to do it, we had an architect who was so passionately committed to the idea that design can make a difference in certain scenarios. And it was through his connection that I ended up studying the Viennese example, which I think really genuinely was a case where intelligent, thoughtful design improved the quality of the space at low cost and also thought about autonomy carefully. So it was good. It was a journey. I learned, I think, and I questioned my own cynicism as a result of the project. In terms of reactions, well, I think I was glad, Miriam, that you said that I was sympathetic in the book, because, you know, I was trying to write a book that was sympathetic to the humanitarians, because it's fundamentally an ethnographic study of this humanitarian sector. And these
but also to the IKEA guys and whoever, all of them. Yeah. I
mean, I didn't show the section of the film on the IKEA guy, but I will, because it's hard not to like him and the team, even though I fundamentally think that their project is doomed and it was never going to be successful. And they're working in such constrained conditions. And the part of the book that I thought I would get most pushback on was the one on camps. Because when I was writing it, there was an awful lot of stuff about the abolition of camps. It was in particularly that 2020 moment when people wanted to abolish everything, and camps were one of the things that they wanted to abolish. And I was trying to explain why humanitarians build camps. You know, there are good reasons why they do it. And of course, when you raise the criticisms, it's not as though they're not aware of them. The problems are the ones that we're all familiar with, the political constraints in the country, the fact that resourcing and budgets are on a one-year cycle, so they've only got 1 year to spend it. And they all said, you know, if we all know this camp's going to be here for a decade and a half, if we got 15 years of funding up front, then we could construct something that was decent and we could think about it. But that's not how the humanitarian world works. So I suppose it's all predictable stuff when it comes to their reactions about the constraints. I think the one thing that I may have had some traction is just the techno-optimism, you know, getting people to think a bit more cynically about when designers claim that they can solve a problem.
Shall we take another answer? We'll start with Jess and then Sophie. Are there any questions online? Yeah, let's take Jess and then Sophie. Oh, sorry. Take two in the room and then some online.
Hello, I'm Jessica. I have a stroke, so it's a bit hard to explain, but I use your module as my module conceptualizing the camp, and it's great for this year. But the ethnographic research, what extent do you talk actually the refugees in your ethnographic research? Okay.
Yeah. A good question.
Thanks. That was really incredibly interesting. I two hopefully really quick questions. The first one is if you could talk a little bit more about the difference between autonomy and freedom, and particularly if you think that the first one would lead to the second one. And I've asked this thinking about my own research with refugees in Uganda, where there is a very high degree of autonomy, actually almost complete autonomy, because people are allocated a piece of land, but then incredibly small degrees of freedom. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. And the second one was just if you had encountered any political project where refugees in one way or the other were more on board with the political project here.
Political project
of the squad, sorry.
Okay. Yes, that's a good question. Yes.
Antoine.
I was
saying you.
But you used the word freedom. I was going to say agency. That you did that little disclaimer at the start, you know, to say that of course it it scares social scientists, and rightfully so, but when the definition you gave is very much overlapping with how we understand agency in a broad sense. So yeah, just to distinguish them a bit more.
Yeah.
How many do we have online?
Just one. So we've
Do you
got
want to
one.
read it out?
Yeah, so we have a question from Anna. Do you have an example of a successful shelter, or is it a utopia to have a shelter which ticks all the boxes?
$1 million question.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's, okay, so I'll begin with the question about the ethnography and the approach. So I should say, initially, so this was an ethnography of a humanitarian sector. So I guess the people that I was primarily spending time with and speaking to with those who had visions of shelter, you know, those who were designing it, those who were commissioning it, those who were running it. And I went into every interaction asking, what is your idea of the kind of shelter that you're trying to create? Why do you think this is the approach? What are the problems that you're facing, and so on? So it was about trying to understand that vision and then how it worked in reality. But of course, to understand the shelter, you do need to, of course, appreciate the way that people themselves are inhabiting it and the experiences that they have. So I was speaking to refugees, but of course my access was always constrained in different ways, particularly the inability to, well, you're always relying on the permission of the people who are running the shelter in order to spend any time there, and you can't really stay the night in any of these examples. It was also striking that many of the refugees I spoke to weren't very interested in talking about the shelter, because it was a place that they were moving through. And certainly when you ask questions about what shelter means to them, or how they might conceptualize it, or what elements are important, the conversation only goes so far. And it was always about controlling space and routines and the everyday, as you would probably expect. So yes, and I think that's the main thing. I mean, the other interesting thing to say about the ethnographic process was that, unlike in my previous projects, I filmed the vast majority of the interviews, and I was initially really worried about how this would turn out, because I had always conducted interviews previously in a completely anonymous conditions, promising the people I was speaking to that they wouldn't be named and that I would anonymize them fully in the final report. And I always thought that was the best way to get humanitarians in particular to open up. But the surprising thing I found that in this case, when I had somebody operating a camera pointed at their face when I interviewed them, and I recorded hours of footage. Every interview was, 3 hours long, and I filmed all of it, and only subsequently shaped it into the film. I thought it would close them up, but it actually gave completely different kinds of results. People were performing for the camera in some respect, and they were quite flattered to be filmed. And only one person initially refused to sign the consent form, but then they did subsequently actually sign it. So it was very interesting in that respect, having the camera involved. So this question of autonomy and freedom and agency, it's a complicated one, and it is one that I'm working through, and I probably won't be able to solve and answer all your questions well enough now. And at the end of the book, I'm only beginning to, I think, work it through. Now, as I said at the beginning, the reason that I wanted to use the word autonomy was partly because I think it's a more constrained term in political philosophy. It's not big and ideological, and that it is something that tends to be considered about the small things, the immediate scenario. It's also something that pragmatically, I think it's easier to get humanitarians to think about and to add to what they might consider their principles or action to be. The reason that I was not talking about agency was precisely because autonomy has a lot of political philosophy that is associated with it. And in the final chapter, I'm writing particularly about the philosophy of basic needs, which often includes autonomy as an underlying or foundational need before you can realize the basic needs that many humanitarians end up responding to, by which I mean food and shelter and water and healthcare. And Doyle and Goff, for example, wrote a long book about human needs where they said, autonomy is the foundational need. It's the thing that comes before all those other things, but it is, of course, the thing that humanitarians don't tend to focus on because they are delivering the other needs, which inevitably leads to paternalism. It inevitably has to be top down when you're providing for people's needs, which is why political philosophers tend not to like human needs as a basis of theories of justice. That's why they tend to look instead at either outcomes or at resources or at other things. So it was working through all of that that led me to the idea of autonomy. And it is a problematic word because it has been defined in so many different ways. And I know that initially people interpret it in that Kantian tradition of autonomy being something that only comes when you have reason, right? You know, the Enlightenment sense that you give people the tools of reason and that's how you get autonomous human beings, you know, the ability to make choices that's unclouded by emotion or culture. But I'm actually taking a completely different approach to autonomy, which comes more from John Stuart Mill, which is saying that autonomous action involves acting precisely according to your desires or emotions or culture. And autonomy is instead about the absence of coercion and constraint on your person and on your body. So it's being free from the control and coercion of others. So there are very different understandings of autonomy. And I was keen to emphasize that it's the one in the John Stuart Mill tradition that I'm building on. It's still a liberal principle, right? There's no getting away from that. I'm also not afraid to say that I am a liberal fundamentally, and I think humanitarians are also liberals fundamentally, which is why it's probably a principle that has more purchase, because it fits into the worldview that I think most humanitarians inhabit. But maybe you would disagree with that, and we can have a conversation. So the last question was about which is the shelter which does tick all the boxes. And yes, I mean, I'm afraid the answer is that there is no such thing, because what I'm saying in the book is that the universal shelter can't exist because it always has to be contextual. That's the nature of shelter as a human need. The producing of a list of metrics is always going to be reductive. And because of resource constraints, because shelter is by its very definition short-term and deployed in emergency conditions, there will always have to be compromises and you'll always end up cutting corners. And that's why I wanted to end up by focusing on autonomy, because that's the one thing that you can say lies at the root of shelter, giving people the choice about what element of shelter is most important to them out of that huge number that I outlined at the beginning.
Thank you. I'm going to abuse my position slightly and just jump in on and comment on a couple of things you just said, and then we've got at least one more question out there, maybe more. One is that I think you talked about autonomy and how it kind of can resonate with humanitarians. As I skipped to the conclusion, I read the conclusion even though I hadn't finished the rest of the book. I was thinking about how neatly it fits with the idea of dignity in the principle of humanity, and sort of it feels very intuitive to see autonomy as part of dignity, which kind of speaks to what you were just saying. And the other thing I was really reflecting on throughout my reading, and that you touched on just at the very beginning, but maybe you could elaborate on it a little bit, is I kept thinking, and in fact I was sort of scribbling in the margin, this isn't just about shelter, this applies to the humanitarian sector as a whole, and this kind of tension between autonomy, although you didn't, in the book you don't really introduce the autonomy until the conclusion, but essentially it's this tension between universalism, the kind of universalizing desire or modus operandi of the humanitarian sector on the one hand, and then the ideas of autonomy on the other. And I think it goes well beyond shelter. So I'll give you a little opportunity to reflect on that if you want. And I know Bertrand has a question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom. It's a great book. I've just ordered it, so I'm reading it soon. I guess my question is in relation to going back to autonomy and thinking about autonomy in relation to mobility and autonomy in relation to temporality, the fellowship, and those two issues. The camps you were showing are very, very different in those two terms. Many of them are transient, literally like almost a rain shelter for people who are on a journey. And others are obviously long-term settlements isolated in the middle of nowhere with no way of, I mean, they're not prisons in the sense that they don't have walls, but they have a desert. So that does the same trick, I guess. And I guess the question there is, can you talk about autonomy in a space that by its very nature becomes that? And of course, those UNHCR camps with their sort of biopolitical panopticon-like structures are probably one of the most oppressive things that we can think of. And I just wondered, you showed in your interview that tension that they have between being accountable for every money they spend and not wanting their shelters to be moved around because they lose control. But it's really, how can they then relate to any notion of selfhood or autonomous humanity in a context where you're aiming to create a prison, essentially, an open prison, but a prison.
Definitely. Thanks. From what we saw, at least, I think the sort of critique of the Athens style arrangement is quite different from the other critiques.
Yeah.
And I wondered, given that, if you say anything in the book about relative success, if you want to make any comments about which you think are doing better or worse.
Yeah. Yeah, I realised I didn't take the question about Athens before, about refugees who were committed to the ideological aims of the squats, and there were some people, but it was really relatively few. And I did go to Greece precisely because I thought that this was offering, well, it does offer a positive model. I think there's absolutely no doubt. You know, these places were being created in direct opposition to the Greek camps, which were pushing people to the edge of cities, which were building these incredibly sterile linear places, very much like Azraq. And the squats were trying to say, not just that people need to live in the heart of the city and become part of the community, but also that what shelter has to be considered in a much more holistic way. And it has to involve a recognition that it is political and that it is social and it's communal. So on paper, I thought, this is absolutely the model that I want to discuss. But I suppose against what I expected, many of the results of the conversations I had, I suppose, pushed me into a humanitarian way of thinking about what the advantages and disadvantages are of embracing a more political or ideological stand when you're trying to do good in the world. And it seemed quite clear from the beginning that not only did the people running the squats have a very clear ideological agenda, but they were pushing it on the people who were coming to live in the places. Some squats more than others, because they were all very different. Now, City Plaza was the only one that I actually got access to visit, because it was the more ideologically moderate of the squats. It was associated with who were then the ruling party, the leftist ruling party, rather than being one of the very hard left anarchist squats, whom I asked for permission to go into and attended their committees and presented the project. But of course, they were absolutely not interested in, I mean, they were very suspicious of me. So while recognizing that there were differences and that some of them were more ideologically driven than others, there was still, nevertheless, this quite obvious tension between the desires and the aims of the refugees who were living in the squats, which, as I said, primarily was to live in a functioning nation state with secure borders, and the aims of the squats, which was to smash the nation state and to have a world without borders. And there's no point shying away from that tension, however good actually the experience of the model was compared to the alternatives. So if I was forced to say, yes, comparatively, which were best, the squats, absolutely. I would far rather live in City Plaza than in any of those camps, like without a doubt. And comparatively, the Viennese example was quite a good story as well. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about the Greek squats, and I'm also happy to be pushed back if you want to push back on the value of what they're trying to do, which I do, of course, understand. It's also about trying to tackle the root causes of the problem. On these issues of autonomy, so Bertrand, you're saying, so to what extent can we talk about increasing autonomy and prioritizing autonomy in conditions of enormous restriction, right? And that for me was precisely the attraction of this concept, because I think it's Joseph Raz who has this great section in his book where he says, autonomy is not an all or nothing affair. Unlike freedom, it's something that can be advanced incrementally, and we can have autonomy over whether or not I have sugar in my tea or not. Whereas we wouldn't necessarily talk about freedom in the same terms. I think he even has this thing about salt in food. And he says it's actually a bigger indignity sometimes to lack autonomy over the small things in our life, because we expect the big things in our life to be out of our control. You know, when the government changes in the US, particularly if you're not in the electorate, it feels completely out of control, even though it's probably the biggest thing in all of our lives right now. But if you're told what you can and can't eat for breakfast, that feels like far bigger of an indignity. So it's precisely because of the different scales that I found it useful as a concept. And as to your point, just going in reverse, yes, I see that's precisely the connection with dignity and humanity. Although there is no getting away that there is as I said, a particular liberal ideal of the human that is embedded, I think, in all of these principles, and it shares that. So it's partly for those pragmatic reasons that I think that it might have purchase. I mean, who knows?
Thanks. We have at least one more question. So let's go to okay. Yeah, start with Rasheen and then we'll.
Yeah, it struck me when you were talking just then about autonomy, how much it's the same as like parenting guidance, right? To give children autonomy within controlled boundaries, which is also paternalistic, but kind of more individual autonomy. It helps people to build a sense of self and so on and all of those kind of things. But I wondered then about the ways in which safety is used in service of control. And I was thinking in particular in the camps, like concerns around fire and how that has played out in terms of the big fires that have taken place in the camps, and how that narrative then gets used to reassert control and to create these spaces. And I also wondered, this is just an aside out of interest, what spaces for children there were in any of these settlements.
Sorry,
another question.
Yeah, just going back to the squats again. So I think there was one speaker that was interviewed, a British guy, that said at the very end there was no obvious lessons that governments and institutions could take from the squats because of the political underpinnings of them, and the fact they can't be copied and pasted. Whereas the rest of it was kind of taken up with saying how the squats were a much more humane and arguably better way of doing things. And it's just interesting to note that, like, since then, obviously the squats have all been shut down.
Yeah.
And in Greece, it's become far, far more controlled. The types of camps are become even more centralized. So do you find like that dominant way of thinking of the squats in a political bubble, like they're almost impenetrable for other like more liberal or governments to actually take any of the good parts out of it? Or do you think they're unrelated?
Well, I think you precisely identified the problem, because the interviewees, who by the way didn't always have their bylines because I had edited a longer version of the film, who tended to criticize squats, obviously were coming from a different ideological perspective. But those two, Daniel Howden, who's a journalist actually, and then one of them who worked for NGOs, the point that they were making was, this is not scalable. And at the very most basic level, there were tens of thousands of people who needed accommodation in Greece. And I mean, the movement of the squat said, well, we have tens of thousands of buildings that are empty in Athens, but it was the amount of labor that was required to actually clean and sort the buildings out and then run these as self-governing communities that would have actually made it unviable at scale. I mean, if you were sitting in the UNHCR office, and I did interview the UNHCR representative, the squats are just simply not a model that you can emulate. But as you say, that's because you're working in an entirely different framework of nation states and of final status and of legal rights and so on, that the people who are running the squats were in a way rejecting. So the fact that it's not a transferable model doesn't mean that it can't be acknowledged for its positive things. But the reason we have asylum seekers is of course because of the borders. So safety was always used, I think, in all of these examples in the service of control, of course, and if I go through them, in Tempelhof Airport, there were security guards at every door. So if you wanted to walk between any part of the site, there was always security guards there. And this was one of the things that made people's lives utterly miserable. The sense that they were always being watched, they were always having their papers checked. But the people who ran it said this was entirely for security, because if they had 500 single men in one room, and if they were all kicking off, and if they had a fight, they needed to be able to break it up. This is what they said. In Azraq camp, you weren't allowed trees. I mean, I found this hilarious, but you weren't allowed trees in case, for security reasons, in case gunmen hid in them. That was the reason that they would say. But there is definitely something to this notion of safety and control as being two sides of the same coin. Because if you think about a aid sector which was entirely driven by the principle of autonomy, it does look possibly like that conservative appeal for vulnerable people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That's the negative side of autonomous action. And if you're saying, well, people can make their own decisions, it means, well, how do you monitor for vulnerability? And that gets you back to the aid workers who wanted to control Azraq because they felt they had lost control in Zartri camp. The reasoning wasn't because they wanted to control, but it was because they didn't know where vulnerable people were. because they had put them down at this address, and then suddenly the containers had been moved to the other side of the camp. So that, yeah, there's a positive and a negative side, I think, to that safety and control. And with autonomy, you do lose that, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time for coffee and cake on the ground floor. So thank you so much. Ground floor.